My name's Dr. Paul Brewerton, the Strengths Guy, Doctor of Psychology and Chair and Founder of Strengthscope. I podcast each week just as you're getting your head back into work mode to give you a positive, strengths-based boost into your week ahead. My podcasts are packed full of tips and tools to help you get the best out of your working week. I hope you enjoy this week's podcast. Hi, my name's Dr. Paul Brewerton, the Strengths Guy. This is the Psychology at Work podcast. I am the founder and chair of Strengthscope, Doctor of Organisational Psychology and Chartered Occupational Psychologist. And I'm delighted to welcome to the show today, Andy Chandler, the Managing Director of Barefoot Coaching. Andy, would you like to say a few words by way of introduction, please, for the listeners and viewers?
Hello, Paul. Well, first of all, hello, everybody. So I'm Andy Chandler, MD at Barefoot Coaching. My intro goes a little like this. I'm a dad, a brother, a son, a friend, an uncle, a great uncle, actually, recently. Cool. I am a coach. I'm a team coach in particular. And I'm the MD of Barefoot Coaching. So actually, I wear all of those different hats, and hopefully that'll resonate with a lot of people who are listening in, because I'm sure they're joining this call with many different hats on as well. So I'm going to be all of those people in a kind of confused mess as we go through the rest of the podcast.
I love it. And it's just so relatable, right? Because immediately there's that, I'm all of those things, or some of those things, or I've got other things. And I am wearing some of these hats literally now. And I know that I'm going to have to put another one on when I, get to the end of listening to this podcast or later on today or whatever. So thank you for sharing all of that. So you've mentioned a couple of things that I want to pick up on, because we're going to be talking today about strengths and the use of strengths in the context of coaching. And I think anyone who is applying strengths, using strengths, particularly in coaching and specifically in team coaching, is going to be fascinated by what we're going to be discussing. So that's the kind of route map. That's what we're going to be talking about. But before we get into all of that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your multi-hatted story. Not necessarily the full story behind every hat. However, it would be great to hear about how you got into coaching, how you got into team coaching, because that is interesting in itself as a kind of subset, which not every coach will get into, but many choose to. How your relationship with Barefoot came about and how strengths fits in. And I'm also very conscious that that's 4 questions in one. So whichever you wish to answer first, middle and last, it's entirely up to you.
Are you sure you don't want the whole story from every hat?
Okay.
No. So to answer that then. So a few things to kind of say as a way of introduction, I think, is, at Barefoot Coaching, we talk often about kind of disorienting dilemmas, and the part that disorienting dilemmas play in helping us kind of learn and have to reflect. I had my own disorientating dilemma. Oh my God, I've got to say that properly. Should we start that again? So
I'll just carry on, because it's just,
are you sure?
So, yeah,
sounds rubbish.
It's great.
So I had my own kind of disorienting dilemma, really, from being in a corporate life, and I think this is a story that many people often relate to, and many of the people actually who come into coaching and train with Barefoot Coaching in particular are often going through some form of kind of state of puzzlement or challenge. Mine was that I was in a corporate career that actually I loved. I really loved it. I was in kind of an organization, global organization, really loving being in leadership positions, definitely. Really excited often by the work that I did, exposed to lots of different experiences that I probably would never have ever had the opportunity, and in many ways could never quite believe that I had the opportunities I had. And yet there was something that just felt amiss. It's kind of difficult to describe. There's just something about the place that I was at where I just didn't feel that fulfilled. And probably a good idea now to say that I'm a big fan, by the way, of Strengthscope. And so I'll just start with that. And so therefore, some of the things that I think I'll talk about and we'll talk about today will kind of borrow heavily from some of my experience with Strengthscope in particular. But it's probably a bit akin to that, that golden question you ask when working with teams or individuals about how often do you get to use your strengths in your job or at work?
Yeah.
And then that's met with that kind of moment of kind of critical reflection and silence. And sometimes, yeah, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways that was what was going on for me. I just wasn't sure whether I was getting to use my strengths at work. So for me, yeah, I started to train as a coach. I trained with Barefoot Coaching actually back in kind of 2014. And I think from then the lights really went on. I mean, like I was really immediately compelled, immediately taken by this thing called coaching to be something that could be really powerful and could be used with many other people in very powerful ways. So yeah, I think when I trained to become a coach, I think I told myself it was because I wanted to be a better leader and I wanted to use coaching skills to be a better leader.
Yeah.
But probably it was a lifeboat. I was thinking, actually, I wonder how I could maybe have a different career. Maybe I could do more of the stuff that I'm really enjoying around coaching and developing others.
Yeah.
And that's really where that came from. So yeah, come 2014, kind of still in corporate life, trained, and then worked my way through getting out of corporate life, starting my own business as a coach, which I loved, by the way. I loved the idea of going from corporate life to starting my own business. And naturally drawn to teams. I don't know why initially. I think kind of fascinated by their complexity, and finding myself drawn more and more to working with teams of people. They often say you teach what you need to learn. And I find myself often working with teams who are often amazing teams, but often struggling with either each other, their circumstances, or some of the challenges that they've got coming up. So team coaching kind of, I don't know, came to me, I think, rather than me going to it. And then there really started a huge amount of kind of self-development and learning, and some of it very formal learning around team coaching, and often a lot of informal learning through actually the act of team coaching itself. So that's kind of how I came to team coaching, I guess.
That's okay. So I've got about 14,000 questions. I'm not going to go with all of them. I have a question about the transition from corporate into your own coaching business. Just as a quick kind of headline on that, you said you really enjoyed that. I know, having spoken to many people as they're about to take that leap, there can be some anxiety around it. There can be some concern. Am I going to be able to make this a business? But you said you found that a really enjoyable, I don't know if it was an enjoyable transition, but it was enjoyable having your own business. Have you got a mini story you can tell around that, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this is again a very kind of common story that happens, particularly people that want to move from a kind of more formal, structured corporate life into running their own business.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to start by just truthfully saying that whilst it was a great experience, there were moments of high anxiety. And in particular, probably the most, I mean, I remember the time when for the first time ever in my life, a client asked me how much I wanted to charge them for the work I was going to do. I've never done that. I'd never done that before. I'd always got paid on the 25th of the month. It didn't matter what I did, really. And so that was incredible. Like what an experience that was. What a moment that was when we actually dared to put a value on ourselves. So that was quite an extraordinary time. I think for me, I was lucky in some ways in that I think for many people who choose to become a coach, if you look at the ICF, there's a local, recent global survey from the ICF, 2022 global survey. And in it says 93% of respondents, and there are about 13,000 respondents, by the way, 93% of them who are coaches say that they have income from things other than coaching.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So the first thing to say is actually for many people thinking, I just want to be a coach. That may be the case, but actually many coaches don't just coach. They facilitate, they train, they educate, they do a whole range of other things. From my perspective, I was lucky in that I think I had a good network. I'd already had that kind of corporate background. So I started fishing with the clients that I already knew. And because I had those good relationships, I could do that. That isn't true for many, by the way.
Yeah.
Actually, there is a big difference, isn't there, between being a really good coach and actually having a really good coaching business.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like we talk about, it's huge, isn't it? And so that's one of the kind of big challenges, I think, for many people who are coming into the industry for the first time. And often we focus, there's a lovely model I remember seeing. I can't remember now who this belongs to, so we'll see if we can find the source for some notes. But it was called Performance Image Exposure Model. And it was some work looking at, typically, for many of us that are coming to run our own business for the first time, we kind of think that it's all about us being great coaches. And whilst it is important to be a great coach, the reality is, I think it was something like 10% of your success actually in your business is attributed to whether or not you're any good. 30% is about how you look, your image, your website, how you come across on social media. And largely 60% is about your exposure into the marketplace.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting. So when I started, I was all about, it's all about my performance. I need to go and learn lots of psychometrics, by the way, including Strengthscope and EQI 2.0 and MBTI, you name it, pretty well I did it. But actually the time when I started to really motor in my business was when I was far more focused on networking and exposure.
Yeah, how interesting.
That was a really big moment.
Brilliant tips, right? I mean, anyone who's either in the space of, starting their own coaching practice, or they're in the midst of it and kind of wondering, how do I get more business? There's the answer, or as an answer. You can't do it just by being great and, being passed around from coachee to coachee within, perhaps one or two corporates. You've got to think more broadly than that. And I think many coaches as well will have multiple associate relationships, maybe 2 or 3 as well as having their own direct clients. And that, which is about exposure, that is about working the network and, reaching out and making those connections where you need to. So Andy, tell me what happened next, because, you're now, and you introduce yourself as MD at Barefoot. So what happened? Yeah, well, give us the rest of that story, if you would.
Yeah. So, I think after being in my own business, one of the pieces of work I did was I started to get opportunities to work more and more with Barefoot Coaching as an associate, which I loved actually. And I started, for many people that are listening, I think those that are already associates probably already know this to be true, which is, as an associate, you can get opportunities to work in sectors that perhaps you wouldn't legitimately be able to easily get into. So you kind of do it on the coattails of the organization that has the relationship with the client. So I've noticed with Barefoot, there were opportunities to start to work with clients I wouldn't normally work with, but also to tutor on their flagship coach training program. And of course, that felt like a massive kind of privilege, having trained with Barefoot in 2014, then suddenly to be tutoring on their postgraduate program was like, oh my goodness, it is amazing. So my relationship started to grow a lot through the associate agreement, really, and kind of doing a lot of associate work with Barefoot. And then also the relationship with Barefoot, the relationship with Kim Morgan, Barefoot's kind of founder and CEO, amazing lady, by the way. And I think with that relationship, the opportunity came up to come and work for Barefoot as their MD, to work with Kim to help really grow the business is amazing. We talk about it as a kind of established startup because it's been going since about certainly 25 years.
Wow.
And yet it still feels like it's a startup, like so much opportunity.
Yeah.
We're up to so much in so many different spaces, all largely coaching related.
Yeah.
So that's kind of when I joined. So I joined Barefoot just not quite post pandemic, but it was like early January 2021. So we were just kind of bouncing back from having moved all of our face-to-face programs online
for
the first time.
Wow.
Like incredible, like unbelievable, really. And so that's kind of how I find myself in Barefoot now. And of course, I'm very focused now on both working on the business, but also working in the business, both as MD, but also as a coach.
Yeah. So for those, this is great, right? So I thank you. That's a fascinating story arc, like in terms of where it's gone. And, clearly it ain't done yet. There's going to be more chapters in the book, right? But I think it would be great to understand a bit more about Barefoot Coaching. So I hear about and come across Barefoot Coaching in various different ways. Yeah, as you've mentioned, there is this link with Strengths and Strengthscope. So that's one way. But I see you come up in various different social media. There's people I know who are part of the Barefoot community. And I just like to hear more about it because, you and I have talked about this before a little bit, and I'm fascinated by the business behind the business, like what thinking, what theory and theories and approaches have kind of underpinned the Barefoot Coaching story. If you could say a bit more about that, that'd be great.
Of course, Paul. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, as I mentioned, it started 25 years ago with Kim. She tells the story far better than I. And by the way, I'm relieved that you said you actually see us on social media. We are working very hard. We are working very hard.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad about that, because actually, in a way, we're a kind of best kept secret.
Okay.
And many of even our Barefoot alumni, there are now over 5,000 people that have come through the
Yeah,
Barefoot
right. I mean,
program.
that's a massive number of people who've been through the program.
Incredible. I mean,
Right.
all over the world,
Yeah.
accredited coaches, just
Yeah.
fantastic, and an amazing community. But many of them even say, actually, like, what are you up to? You need to shout more about what you do, because what you do is amazing. So, like, that's a really interesting point about the social media. But yeah, started 25 years ago. Kim started it, and she tells the story far better than I. She describes the story as Goldilocks and the three therapies. Is kind of where it starts, and it all
Come on. What do you mean?
well, I'm never gonna tell it as well as she does, but it starts really with Kim herself, and in particular, at the time, she trained as a Freudian psychotherapist. So she found that that particular approach was particularly rigid, actually. So she found it slightly more difficult, to lack the flexibility, and also perhaps lack the humanity and the warmth. And so, feeling a little dissatisfied with that Freudian approach, she then went kind of almost straight over the other side and started to look at the kind of Carl Rogers work and that kind of humanistic, human-centered, client-centered approach, which in truth, I think, was warmer, more human, but also a little bit sickly sweet, and wondered whether there might be another approach. So at that time, 25 years ago, North America, there was something called coaching going on.
Yeah.
And actually, Kim took many different, kind of an eclectic mix of psychological frameworks and ideas, and created the Barefoot coach training program that largely is still intact today, which is amazing. So,
yeah. So we went from Freudian to cold. And then who was next?
oh, well, it was really over to Carl Rogers.
So humanistic to
Correct.
hot. And then coaching, some sort of combination, but part, its own vibe, right? And that was just right.
That was exactly right. And probably worth saying that one of kind of our mantra at Barefoot is beware the person of one book.
Yeah.
So what we really mean by that is this idea that we like to offer the people that work with us and that learn with us is this idea that there's an eclectic mix. The more knowledge you have of that mix, the more you can offer to your clients in the moment. That's a very important part of who we are. So the psychological kind of genres and foundations are very strong within the work that we do, but they're also very, very broad. That's a really important part of what we do. So Barefoot, I mean, headlines for Barefoot is, I mentioned 5,000 people that have been through the program. Our program started, way back 25 years ago. Very early on, we were one of the first coach training programs to have a university qualification associated with the program. So that was through the University of Chester, the postgraduate certificate.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Which still actually many of the students who work with us go on to complete, which is just fantastic. And that also talks a little bit about who we are, which is it gives people an opportunity, some of whom may not have had an initial university education, the opportunity to get a university qualification. That's important. And some of those go on and then do masters and even PhDs. So it's kind of a fantastic thing. And then in 2011, because when the business was started, the ICF was a twinkle in somebody's eye probably. But in 2011, we were then accredited program with the International Coaching Federation.
Thank you.
Which again felt important, and probably for whoever does reading, if you read any of the newspapers, read anything digital these days, there's often kind of disparaging comments about, for example, life coaching and that lack of kind of, we know that coaching is not regulated. And so we're really keen to push hard on the need for accreditation and credentialing in particular. So.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned ICF a couple of times, but you've now given the long form version. So thank you very much. That's why I said thank you. Because not everyone's going to know, and you're right. I mean, that, if there is a gold standard out there in the world of coaching, it probably is ICF. There are others. But there is no kind of absolute standard that people, seek to attain, because there are varied different bodies. But ICF's a fabulous one.
It is, and you're right to say it's not the only one, because actually we're also, we're proud to have our team coaching practitioner program is accredited with the EMCC, for example. But we've had, and I've actually had personal experience of AOEC, Association for Coaching. There are some fantastic bodies out there. As it happens, you know, we definitely, the main flagship program that we have, which, by the way, just long form, if we're talking long form for a second, I refer to it as a flagship. It's actually called the Postgraduate Certificate, the ICF accredited Postgraduate Certificate in Personal and Business Coaching, which is why we often call it just our coach training program.
Yeah, because if you take the letters and try and put them all together, it kind of creates its own word. But I don't even know what it would be, because that's a lot of letters.
I've no idea. No. But so kind of coach training's at the heart of who we do. And the other thing just worth saying is that we also offer a big part of this. This isn't a sell, by the way, but I thought I'm going to answer your question properly. The other part that we do is that we also offer further development to existing coaches to train coaches. So that can mean a whole range of different ways. But if you want to take a couple of good examples right now, it would be for those people that want to qualify to become a supervisor, a coaching supervisor, then we offer a PG cert in supervision. And for those people that have got a passion for team coaching, then we have a team coaching practitioner program as well.
Honestly, it doesn't sound like a sell. I think it's really important. You mentioned yourself, you know, you're a bit of a best kept secret. I think it's great to get it out there, you know, so people who are in the coaching world can hear that there are those options. You know, I think there's an assumption when you enter the world of coaching that all of this stuff is obvious. It's not obvious, and there aren't that many places that offer these kinds of qualifications. It's not obvious where to look. And so I think it's great that actually, from what you said, you can come to Barefoot Coaching and there's going to be a variety of different ongoing, continuous development options, continuous professional development options for you. Whether or not you've kind of entered, you know, the standard route, there are other things that you can come along and try. So I was looking at your website actually earlier, and you know, the taster session sounds fantastic as well, just to come in and be able to ask questions, to get a little bit more under the skin, to make it a completely transparent process for people so that they can understand what it is that they're investing their time and their money in if they choose to go down that road. I think that's you know, I think that's a pretty courageous thing to do. I think it's a really important thing to do as well, because there's lots of questions people come with.
The taster sessions, I'm glad you mentioned that, by the way. I mean, the taster session was one of the things I was immediately struck by with Barefoot. And as it happens, back in 2014, I didn't go on a taster session because my purchasing kind of criteria was just asking a couple of people that I knew and trusted and said, you know, you've trained as a coach, who was good? And they said, oh, Barefoot. And that was it. Yeah. But for many people, you know, it's a big decision to decide who you're going to train with. And what I love about our taster sessions is they really are, they are about just experiencing what it's like to learn with Barefoot. There's no sell, there's no push, there's an opportunity to understand a little bit about what it feels like to be in a room full of maybe 12 or 15 people, learning together, picking up a framework or two, doing a bit of practice, doing a bit of reflection, getting some feedback. All of those things are present. I think the taster session is exactly that. We kind of talk about like choosing a coach training provider is like choosing a house. There's like an element of chemistry. In fact, it's like choosing a coach, right? It's like there's an element of chemistry associated with it. You kind of know when you found the right one, and you kind of know when it's not quite right.
I love it. And so why not have a taste? Because you know, you need people who want to commit to be the right people, right? So if that's their bag, if they want to have that kind of experience, you know, I think it's great. Okay, so let's go away from that for a minute. Or we're not going to go away from Barefoot Coaching, because everything we talk about relates to your experience, your practice, and a lot of that has come through, you know, the organization. But I want to talk about psychometrics. You mentioned that you've been accredited yourself in a whole raft of different psychometrics. But when we've spoken before, you've described the role of psychometrics in general, or in coaching, in a really interesting way. And I'd love it if you could, you know, bring that analogy back, or maybe if you've got a couple, I don't know.
Who knows? Yeah, I remember our first conversation about this. I loved it. And it made me think a lot about it, actually, about psychometrics. So, so there's probably a couple of things to say. So I do have a love of psychometrics, but I think they're like many things. It's kind of important to have them in context and in the right way. And the way I think about psychometrics, and I've heard this a number of times before, and I've really loved it. I can't even remember who I heard it from originally, but it really resonated with me, which is this idea that seeing a psychometric tool is more of a kind of tin opener than it is a tape measure. And like that really resonates for me. And actually also resonates for many of my clients when I talk to them
Totally.
that way.
What
It's
do you
like a
what do you
relief.
mean for those people who don't immediately, because I'm like Myers-Briggs N analogy, great, give me more of those models. But what do you mean?
Yeah, I'm also I have a preference towards N.
Yeah,
And yeah, so what that really means is instead of like coming away from it and saying, well, okay, so I'm going to take a psychometric,
yeah,
let's say MBTI, but it could be anything. Um, if you really decide that that is going to define who you are,
mm,
that you are going to be put in a box, you're going to be told that you are ENFJ.
mm,
If you are going to use it as a point of kind of defining you, I think that's not helpful, actually.
mm.
I
And that's
think
the tape measure part, right?
that's
So
the
that would
tape measure
be
part,
we've
without a
got you
doubt.
precisely measured and you fit in that particular box, and
Correct.
there we are done.
Correct. But if you choose, on the other hand, to say, no, you know what, imagine this, like a psychometrics, just taking the top off the tin, looking down into the tin and finding a few kind of questions that are going to make you really just reflect for yourself.
Yeah,
And that becomes really powerful. I had a good
yeah,
example of that last week working with a leadership team of a professional services business. And in fact, funnily enough, we were running a session on strengths.
right.
So using Strengthscope, they'd all done
Mhm.
their own individual Strengthscope. We were doing Strengthscope team as well with them.
Yeah,
And actually with that positioning, because actually they probably, I would say, would default very quickly to this defines who we are.
mhm.
Like, that is you. That is
Yeah,
absolutely you. And there was something very healthy about this idea of saying, actually, let's just keep some distance from this for a second. That doesn't devalue the psychometric. The psychometric is incredibly
mm,
powerful, but how you choose to interact with the psychometric matters.
absolutely agree.
And so, yeah, so that's kind of the thinking that I've got. And I think it's like, whether it's a psychometric or whether it's a theory or a framework, there's this
Mm,
lovely Jung quote, like, learn your theories as well as you can, but put them aside when you touch the miracle of the human soul. Like that's what it's about for me. It's like, you can have your psychometrics and you can have your theories and you can have your frameworks, but in the end, there's something magical about working as one human
isn't
with
there?
another or with a group of
Isn't
humans.
there? So on that analogy, and I when you shared it with me, I've not heard it before, and I found it so powerful, and I fully agree with it. It's a conversation starter, right? It's a start point for further investigation in a coaching context or from a self-reflection point of view. And taking Strengthscope, I know many psychometric products. We're talking a little bit about Strengthscope today. When I have conversations with people coming into the Strengthscope team, and we have getting to know, we're at 34, 35 staff now, so I think about that. So that means there's a lot of people that we get to know these days. And actually, we had 5 new joiners, I think, last week or in the last 2 weeks. That spent 5 separate meetings where we share strengths. So I'll always ask the question, what are your top 3 strengths that you picked yourself? And then tell me your story about those. And so first of all, there's a number of strengths in the Strengthscope profile. It's highly unlikely that you're going to hear the same 3 strengths selected by anybody, right? That's an element of individuality. But the true joy and the soul of the conversation comes from their description of why that's important to them, how those strengths work together, how they work independently of each other, where they've come from, what's the story that's got them to the point where they are inhabiting these strengths, they're utilizing these strengths, and the joy that they bring, the energy that brings into the conversation is just palpable. And it's every single time you see the person in that conversation. And so for me, that analogy of tape measure versus can opener, for psychometrics, I think is just so important for anybody who's working in coaching, for any psychologist, for anybody who's working with psychometrics. Remember, it's just a start point for understanding and uncovering more about yourself or about the people that you're working with. Because if you take it from that perspective, it can be so powerful rather than just, measure and done, move on.
I love that, Paul. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I also love the fact that one of the things I really notice, I mean, I know that I've been talking a lot with David, your MD,
Yeah.
David Lincoln, and it's been great to kind of get to know what you guys are up to in your business. But your authenticity about how you use strengths in your business is fantastic, by the way. I just wanted to say that.
Thank
because
you.
I've just really noticed it. Like, you absolutely use strengths regularly within
I
your business.
love it.
I think
I
it's
love
fantastic.
it. I just find they're just the most powerful conversations, like I think, and having come across strengths and whatever it is 15, 16 years ago, for the first time, I'd never go back, because it's just, the world is richer with that approach. It enables a different level of connection, a different level of understanding, a different level of energy in the conversation. So this isn't an advert for Strengths and Strengthscope, but it definitely is for psychometrics being a tool for exploration rather than a tool for measurement and done. So yeah, that's great. I mean, talking about psychometrics, it's a great conversation. And now we're talking a little bit about Strengthscope. How do you feel? How have you experienced, Andy, Strengths and Strengthscope playing a role in coaching specifically, and also in team coaching?
Well, obviously I found it very fascinating, but also very useful. And I think I just want to say something about this idea of being useful. Many team coaches that I work with will often talk about being helpful. And I want to be really careful. I say the word useful rather than helpful. I think that the desire to be helpful puts our need to be helpful ahead of the client's need. So I just want to start with that, this idea of being useful. I find Strengths incredibly useful. I find Strengthscope incredibly useful, actually, from a kind of very early start when I first kind of trained with you in particular. So there's a few things there. The first thing is, I think, kind of the strengths-based approach resonated with me as a human being anyway, as an individual. I found it immediately energizing, and that in itself was kind of fascinating. So the kind of starting point is, I think Strengths has the capacity to create a very safe space in what can be a very uncertain and often difficult place, particularly when you're working with teams. And I've got a few examples of those. We might get onto that in a little bit. But I think helping people and teams to really kind of connect with their innate brilliance, I think is fantastic. Even before the world of Strengths, one of the exercises that we would often run in Barefoot with many of our clients would be this kind of blowing our own trumpet, or what have we got going for us? That would be a big part. So there would be a natural push towards kind of positivity and connecting with those characteristics that you bring, either individually or as a team. But then when you've got strengths involved, it's like it's on steroids. It's extraordinary in terms of the positivity that then is kind of created, the wave of positivity, and more importantly, that kind of settling for the team. Because often, I remember learning, one of the first things I learned about was this idea that actually if you're presented with a client who is purely in survival mode, we know that part of their brain that is required to help them benefit from coaching is just not available to them. And so actually, I think there is something about Strengths being used as a way of moving people from survival into competence. I don't know whether you've experienced it that way at all, but I've definitely experienced it.
100%. I've even got, example of that. I can't remember if we shared this when we had that conversation the other day, or if I talked about it, but using it in exec recruitment, right? It's just one example. And there are some tools, some psychometric tools out there that are really helpful to understand what might derail an exec, when they move into a senior leadership role. Hogan Darkside, for example, Hogan Development Survey, shorthanded to Hogan Darkside or HDS. But it's really challenging to debrief that because people often put the shutters up and they will say things like, oh yeah, that used to be like me. It's not me anymore. I've learned how to deal with all of those, qualities that you're associating with me based on my responses to the questionnaire that you asked me to complete. And there's kind of an irony in that. It's you did say these things about yourself though. However, you place Strengthscope in front of an HDS debrief, and what you get is people, first of all, owning their strengths. So talking about me at my best. I acknowledge this is in a recruitment context, so people are going to want to present themselves at their best, but they're able to do that authentically because they're talking about what their strengths mean to them and how they've used them in leadership roles. Then you can move into a conversation around strengths in overdrive. They'll own that because they'll recognize that me at my best has a shadow side, and that can manifest in different ways. And any strength can have an overplayed version, and then they will accept and acknowledge the whole of the HDS debrief because they've already acknowledged that there are certain vulnerabilities that they have, and actually those will be seen repeated in the Hogan Development Survey, just in a different format. And it's interesting because they come from completely different paradigms. Strengthscope is based around strengths, which is based in positive psychology. HDS is coming from psychopathology, and what can go wrong with people. And yet there is a point of overlap. But I think that the ordering of the conversation creates sufficient safety if you start with strengths to enable a much more challenging conversation to unfold in that high stakes context. And I think for me, that's one of the best examples of how you create psychological safety using strengths.
I think it is. I mean, I would say the assumption in that, which I think is, or rather the thing to pull out that you're making me think about, is also the importance of the quality of the facilitation and the coaching that takes place around it, because, in a way we're in that really kind of privileged position. But equally there comes a downside. Like if we don't do this well, like we are in danger of potentially doing some damage. And I think that's an important part of this, even with strengths, actually, I don't know about you, Paul, one of the things, I mean, clearly, this better than I do, but my experience of working with strengths is one of the kind of immediate dilemmas that I'm often met with is I have to really work hard at differentiating between strengths and capability.
Yes. Yeah.
Like every time, I can almost guarantee it.
Yeah.
And I can try talking about it in lots of different ways, but get that wrong. And actually, it can be pretty complicated. There's work required to be very careful about this difference between this is all about where you get your energy versus, your actual core capability and skills in particular. Yeah. So I think there is something about the importance. And, I've been on your own training program, which I think is excellent, by the way, and very rigorous. I think that's important for me. And I think that's very important for anybody who's going to go into this work. I think is to make sure that
it's a good point, right?
They really are well qualified to do it.
You need to be trained. Yes, it's true. Yeah, thank you. Good reminder. Yeah, so we were talking about your experience of the strengths approach. Is there any more you want to add around how you found it or where you found it valuable?
I mean, whether it's the specific example. I mean, I've got a leadership team that I was working with even only kind of 3 months ago. And this is a leadership team who were really troubled. I mean, they've got significant change that was going on, but like many leadership teams, they found themselves kind of in the middle of like a whole pile of resistance to a lot of the changes they were trying to put in place. And actually they benefited. I'll kind of maybe give a little bit more context. I mean, for many of the listeners who probably are involved with understanding lots about resistance, I mean, one of the bits of work I like is by Rick Murray, who talks about resistance. One of the reasons I like his work, by the way, is because he largely is very pragmatic. He's like, it's pretty easy for clients to get, and it's pretty easy for me to get. Just this idea that resistance shows itself in 3 ways. He's got level 1, 2, and level 3. So level 1 is people saying, I don't get it. Right. So level 1 resistance, I don't get it. And often that will be met by people saying, okay, well, let me help explain it to you, blah, blah, blah. Level 2 is like, oh, I get it, but I don't like it. And that's about how do you actually really engage people with the change that's coming. And level 3 is, look, I get it, I kind of like it, but I'm not sure I trust you as an organization that you're serious about this. So I like that work.
That's such truth right there, isn't it? It's so visceral, it's emotional when you hear it. It's like, that's what's happening with the 3rd level. Oh, I'm not wow, okay, but it's very real, because that's exactly what happens with resistance.
It really is. And I think, this particular leadership team found themselves actually with all 3 levels of resistance at play. Right. So they were really, I wouldn't say in meltdown, but they were in a seriously difficult situation. Like they were seriously triggered around trying to work out what's going on. And so for them, that then kind of created, frustrations, dysfunction, and whichever way you measure dysfunction, effectively, they were finding it very difficult to work with each other, never mind lead complex change. That's a big part of it. So kind of when I met them for the first time, I was presented with a group of people, definitely not a team of people, a group of people who were stressed to the eyeballs, who were kind of at odds with each other. If anything, they were kind of fighting against each other in terms of trying to make the change happen. So for me, I think what happened was I used strengths very early on to do a couple of things. The first was to create that kind of headroom for themselves to get out of the survival mode, to reconnect with their kind of innate strengths and those things that give them energy. but also in a way to change the conversation. That wasn't to avoid it. That wasn't to avoid all of the change that's coming and all of the trickiness with the stakeholders, but it was to say, how can we get this team into a place where they can be receptive to all of the things that are going to happen next? And there are many things that are going to happen next, some of which we're working on now and much of which is coming. But the starting point was working on their own individual strengths, identifying those, thinking about how they can use those in the service of the team and the change that they find themselves in. And then also actually looking at it from a team's point of view and that broader kind of team strengths perspective. So it was settling. It was another example for me where it was actually just a really settling thing to do to get to the point where they were then competent again to be able to take on other interventions.
As you say, psychological safety 101, right? You've got to get safe before you can even imagine having a good idea. What was it? I heard a senior member of our sales team went to the CIPD conference this week. I think it was I can't remember the name of the conference, but it's one of the CIPD conferences. And
the Festival of Work.
Festival of Work. Thank you very much. Did you go?
I did, yeah. And very quickly, really quickly, I went to the wrong venue. So therein lies because
their communications just weren't good enough about them. What does this say? What do we learn from this?
Well, I'm blaming you because of Strengthscope, a couple of my significant 7, decisiveness and enthusiasm. So for the last 3 months, I've been telling people I was going to the CIPD Festival of Work at Excel. Right. Because I say it with such confidence and with such enthusiasm, people thought they must have changed the venue, and nobody told me, but normally they have it at Olympia. And so, so I went to Excel. I'm sorry, but that's basically what happened. So I went all the way to Excel, got there really early.
But how many other people did the same thing because of your enthusiasm?
Well, I've no idea, but I was met with a lovely lady who asked me, she said, I'm sorry, we don't CIPD, no, but we've got a symposium on natural stone. Are you here for that?
Oh,
like, I mean, who thought you could have a symposium on natural stone?
Funnily enough, one of my best friends was probably there because that's the area of specialism for her business.
No,
literally true thing.
Well, anyway, sorry, we were talking about CIPD. Sorry.
Yeah, what was it? So this was one of the senior sales team who said the best thing that they heard at that conference, which was at Olympia, I understand.
It was.
One of the best things she heard was that no one ever had a good idea while being chased by a tiger. And I think that's the important point here, that in order for you to get past that, survival mode and into any place where you can even think about what do I need to think about, you've got to get safe, and as you say, having strengths as that opportunity to breathe, almost a fire break, if you like, I think is a very powerful idea and a really important one, to enable people to step back and recognize that they will have the strength to get through this, but they've just got to take a minute, and start to reflect a little bit on what they can bring to the situation rather than panicking.
The psychological safety bit. I mean, I know it's been I was dining out on Tim Clark's work, Dr. Tim Clark's work on psychological safety.
Good stuff,
and also Amy Edmondson, I think, if I recall. But, the kind of similar themes, aren't they, about what is it you need to do? And actually, what is it as you as a leader can do that will immediately contribute to psychological safety? And frankly, what are the things that effectively are you pressing a big, dangerous red button? Like, what are the things you do that create that kind of danger for those people around you? And I think, being aware of all of those things is really important. But I think strengths is a really good way of getting people initially. It may not create psychological safety in its own right. I think it can build trust. I mean, that's an important part. I think it can build trust, and it can build help to build a sense of belonging. And, you can share a bit. I found it very useful as a way of getting to know each other. Using strengths as a way of getting to know each other is like fantastic. Like, that can work really well. It's not the only solution, but I think it's a very good contributor towards that.
Yeah. Andy, what about where it's been the strengths approach I'm thinking here, and where it's just been more difficult to land? So in your experience working within team coaching as a context, where has it not worked out so well? Where, you've got any examples of that?
Well, I think I've got lots of examples where if I had only gone down the strengths route, I think it wouldn't have been enough. Actually, I think the strengths can go a long way without a doubt. But fundamentally, it's this idea that is, if all you've got is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, because I think I really relate that point to many things. So, you know, for example, if you're going into an organization, you're coming at it from a kind of, as a team coach in particular, you're coming out and saying, right, okay, so we're going to do some work on, you know, Lencioni and 5 dysfunctions. Like, great work, really nice framework. People love that. But actually, that in its own right may not be enough. There's an awful lot more you may need to attend to. So I think that the kind of first thing I'd say is that clients are looking for a silver bullet, without a doubt. Team coaches think they want a silver bullet, but the reality is life is not, for me anyway, life is never that simple. It's never that straightforward. And therefore, you have to accept that there are actually multiple approaches and lots of different lenses that are required. Honestly, being a team coach, I mean, I'm not actually that courageous. Throughout my whole life, I don't think I've been particularly courageous. When I'm in front of a team, working with them as a team coach, fortunately, I think I find that courage, because it does take courage to work with teams, because it's uncertain. You don't know where, you know that, don't you? Because I know you work with teams all the time. You don't know where it's going to go. And so the kind of, for me, the fundamental is strengths plays a very important part. If you only focus in on one aspect, one discipline, one area, I think there is a danger in doing that. And like, for example, like the basics of effective teams, I don't know about you, but for those that I've worked with, the teams that are kind of more effective, the characteristics that are going on there is that largely each member of the team, they're good functional leaders for sure. Like, they can do their jobs really well, but each of them, I don't know, carries with them a sense of accountability for making the team work. So, like, I wouldn't quite say it's half and half, but pretty well they're as focused on what is it they can do to create a really effective team as they are on their own kind of accountability for their functional role. That doesn't happen all the time. So I think unless you've got that to start with, you're going to find it pretty tricky to really help that team move into that kind of highly effective space, I think.
I agree with that. And I think actually, strangely, when you were talking about how, you know, you don't want to take one approach, because working with teams is complex and you've got to kind of figure out where they're at and what they need right now. There's something reassuring about that. There's something reassuring about not having to have all the answers immediately, you know, and that's how I took it anyway, rather than thinking, oh I need to go out and get trained in another 14 different, you know, methodologies or approaches, because that way I'll have the answer. The answers will come, but you don't have to force it, and you shouldn't try to, I don't think. But I do think, you know, with experience of working with teams, you do start to see patterns. You start to see, you know, you can kind of stage a team sometimes as to where they are on the development journey, or but also, I mean, you know, gathering data on that is really helpful. You know, finding out, having some good searching questions you can ask to uncover, you know, what's the team's recent experiences been, what's their context right now, what are they trying to achieve, what trauma might they have experienced in the recent past. All of those things can be very helpful as well. But I share your view. You know, it's a complex environment that you're working in when you're working with teams, and I don't think it's right to expect yourself to have all the answers all the time. You know, it's
no.
So supervision can be super helpful with that as well. You know, to be able to go somewhere to get a second view. And just sitting with it, you know, and sort of the answers will come.
Yeah, and I mean, potentially you're right. Supervision, like, feels crucial, to be honest with you. Like, that feels so necessary. And actually, I'm not sure, if we're all honest, and for many coaches, whether they do really get enough supervision.
I agree.
I think that, you know, Barefoot, from our perspective, we think it's crucial. And of course, we train people to be supervisors, but also we offer supervision. And actually, the uptake on supervision isn't where I think it needs to be. We've got 5,000 people that have trained with us, and very few get supervised, or not enough, if I'm truthful. So I think there's I think there's a kind of industry challenge around supervision. I noticed the ICF, by the way, particularly the UK chapter, are trialing kind of free supervision and making that available to members, which is good. But I agree, your fundamental point about team coaching, it is tricky. And I think there are kind of, the big thing for me is this kind of mindset as a team coach. Like, what's the mindset that you're going to need to enable you to be best equipped to work in this complex environment?
Yeah.
One of them for me is about surrendering a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about a fatalistic putting up a white flag and saying, like, I'm beaten, like it's too complex. I'm talking about being open to the idea that you might not know as a team coach what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Being open to the idea that you don't really know what's going on here, but your heart and your gut, never mind your head, your heart and your gut tell you there's something amiss.
Yeah.
Being open to the idea that, like, it isn't just what's available and present in front of you. It's like what happened in the, you mentioned it earlier. The past has such an impact on the present.
Yeah.
And, for me, I've done a lot of work training with John Whittington's organization, Coaching Constellations, and Systemic Coaching Constellations. And I have to say, like, that's been a revelatio in terms of my own approach to thinking about those kind of hidden dynamics that are happening in teams. So I think the original question there about, like, what are the challenges? I don't think the challenges are actually the challenges of working with strengths. I think the challenges are generic challenges of working with teams and making sure that you've got that kind of a sharp pencil on the issue and then a wide gaze on what's going on around you.
Love that.
And that's what you're trying to do at any one point in time, I think.
We haven't talked about Strengthscope team specifically. Any words on that? You mentioned it earlier in brief, but do you guys use that? Do you use that personally, Andy?
I do, yeah. I mean, I use Strengthscope teams, and I've been using that for a little while. Now, I know that for the listeners, I'm sure many of them know that there's a Strengthscope teams with habits and without habits. I tend to use without habits. So for me, I typically really value, first of all, every team member appreciating what is meant by strengths and what their strengths are. I really appreciate them then getting into a wider conversation about the strengths profile within the team. And I really like this idea of them being clear about what are the risks for this team, what are the opportunities for this team around a particular learning vehicle. Again, what I liked about the training from Strengthscope was, like, everything felt very practical for me, like encouraged to ensure that when you're having a conversation about strengths, it's not just a generic conversation about strengths. You're doing it in the service of something. Like, that's what's really powerful about it. And so, whether that for me was starting with a firm of patent attorneys, actually, which was interesting. They started a personal development program and actually getting them to think about how they're going to use their strengths to get the most out of the 2 years that are following all around their own development. Like, it was amazing, like so powerful. And so for me, I tend to use strengths, individually, look at team profile. The with habits I have used, I do like, but actually I find that I tend to migrate towards the without habits, because I find that I will then move in a whole range of different directions and pull on a whole range of different frameworks, many of which, by the way, are picked up in the with habits framework. So, around accountability and trust and what have you. All of those things will be present, but I'll probably choose a different approach.
There's resonance there with Lencioni, you mentioned, there's Tapman, there's quite a lot actually in the development of the habits that relates to, the kind of, the classic models of team development and team dynamics. So, the work has been done to get it there, but you're absolutely right. You want to keep the door open. It doesn't have to be everything is given to you in a single model or a single tool. But personally, I found the with habits version helpful to stage the team, to see where they're at, to see what, before I go into to work with them, what might be going on for them. Of course, that can be really helpful if you've it's just additional data in addition to having conversations with each of them, or at least, at the very least, with the team leader beforehand, to find out, what's been going on with the team, as we were saying. Like, that diagnostic data is vital. So the with habits section, I think, helps with that, but it's not the only game.
Yeah, and I think you've just made me think there also about it is really helpful, but also Strengthscope 360. Actually, again, incredibly helpful to use that. I think, again, for me, my experience of that has been, it's very useful, and it also, I think, requires some good quality facilitation and coaching to enable the person to be ready for that feedback, but also to try to, again, keep a bit of distance from the actual feedback. It's not the truth, it's somebody else's truth, but helping them determine, okay, what can be said to be true based on the conversation we've just had about all of that feedback.
Yeah.
So but there's something in 360 as well, which I think is very useful.
It's a good point. We've not talked about that, so thanks for bringing that in. I just wonder, before we close, have you got anything that you'd want to, I don't know, leave behind, if you like? Any tips that you would give to aspiring team coaches or current team coaches that you'd just like to share? Any sort of practical tips or suggestions?
Well, there's so many. I mean, we run a team coaching practitioner program, so come on that. That'd be my starting point.
That's a
but if
great
you were
tip.
Yeah, that is a great tip, isn't it? But if you were to do on that, I mean, most team coaches who are out there know what I'm about to say to be true, which is you have to be able to do the work on yourself before you do the work with the client. So that's my belief. And so I think it is very important. And many coaches I know are pretty well addicted to lifelong learning anyway.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important to make sure that you are paying attention to yourself before you go any further. So for example, even in one-to-one work where you might be working, and many of us have probably witnessed this in the last year or two, working with leaders that are going through endings, that there may be difficult endings in particular, you're going to want to bet you better have done some work on yourself around your own relationship to endings before you get anywhere near a client.
Yeah.
And so just really making sure that you've really faced into those things before you, and recognize that they're at play. Like even if you haven't faced into them, there are dynamics that are in play about your relationship with beginnings, endings, joining, whatever it might be, teams. And so I think that becomes a very important part.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And I'd also say finally the stance. So kind of like the mindset is everything for a team coach. Like, of course, your practices, your tools that you use matter, and your skill at being able to do that, as is, by the way, your skill at working often with a co-team coach as well, I think becomes important. But mindset and stance become important. If I had one tip about any of that, I think it would be recognizing that as team coaches, many of our clients want to seduce us into their story. And we can easily collude. And when we collude, we become entangled. And when we become entangled, we become pretty well far less useful to the client.
Yeah.
And so I think watching out for entanglement, which you can do through 1, self-awareness, 2, working with another coach, having some courage, and then also getting supervised. So
I love that. And it's so important. You're talking about useful versus helpful, and I think we probably do feel quite helpful when we're colluding because we're there in support, we're with you. But actually, if we're going to remain useful, we have to remain separate, and that's absolutely vital. And you're right, having those kind of extra eyes and ears on what we're doing from a practice point of view is just so important to keep us in perspective. I think that's absolutely fantastic advice. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anything you'd like to add in terms of, well, actually, we've got the show notes, right? So if there are any references that that we've been talking about as we've been going through this conversation, we'll have those in the show notes. We'll also put in some information about Barefoot Coaching's programs. So that will be in there as well as kind of hyperlinks in the show notes, which is the blog version of this conversation, this podcast, which will be on the Strengthscope resources page, so it's easy to find. Also, though, if people want to get in touch with you, why wouldn't they? I mean, frankly, all people should want to get in touch with you. But for those that really, really do, how should they do that? What's the best way of doing it?
Well, loads of different ways. I mean, you can start, thank you for saying all of that, by the way. So you can start by just coming onto our website, www.barefootcoaching.co.uk. Do that. Cool. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us on Instagram. You can actually drop me a note, or you can just drop Barefoot a note, info@barefootcoaching.co.uk.
Brilliant.
So lots of different ways of getting in contact with us. We're always keen to kind of progress conversations. We're fascinated by the world of coaching. We're learning all of the time as well. We have lots of expertise and knowledge, but actually we've also got plenty of humility to know there's a lot we've still got to learn. And we learn a lot from many of the people we get to meet. So yeah, we'd love to hear of anybody who has a passion for coaching, for team coaching as well. And feel free to reach out. It'd be great to hear of you.
Love it. What conversation. I feel we've just scratched the surface in some areas. Honestly, I could go on and on talking to you, and I will. But probably we won't record every conversation. But this has been an absolute joy, an absolute pleasure, and it's just fantastic to hear from a fellow team coach about the various challenges that you face into, on a regular basis. And you know, it's made me feel less alone, which,
Well,
you know, which is great. And I just, yeah, I feel there's a real point of connection there. So thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it, Andy. And I know that the viewers and the listeners will really appreciate you taking the time as well. So thank you so much.
thanks to you, Paul, as well. It's been a real privilege. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot.